Welcome to, Janice, why do we have feedback, do you think? All right, welcome to the September Harbor Committee meeting. And since it's 8 o'clock, I guess we will get started. So we're rolling, right, Janice?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Sophie Romana will be joining us via Zoom this morning. She has some health things in her house, so we'll take care of that. Let's see. Oh, the usual. Everybody knows this is a public meeting. Minutes are being taken, being recorded. This is all going into the big book.
Turn them up?
Turn them off.
Is that where it's coming? That's what's coming back from?
That's what, the microphones are tied into that.
Oh, they are?
Yes. I'll turn it down a little bit.
Just turn it down.
Try that.
We can hear.
Yeah, that's fine.
Much better.
Not better? Okay.
Yeah, minutes are being taken. If you have questions, direct them through me, please. And that's about that. Let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, we have five voting members this morning, so that's exciting. All right. Let's just get moving then. Public input on non-agenda items. Do we have any? Elliot.
I have a question for Jeremy. We had talked last time about the public access survey, and you said that was in Dave St. Laurent domain. Did you have a chance to ask him what?
And I do know that is, I listened to one of the select board meetings, and it did come up in a select board meeting, that public access survey that they paid $20,000 or something like that for, sort of where is it? And my recollection of that meeting was that basically they were like, yeah, where is that? You know, I don't think it's moved forward, was my understanding of that. All right, any other non-agenda? Awesome. Meeting minutes. Thank you, Bruce, for producing, as always, a perfect minutes from August 31st. Does anyone have any? Did anybody get a chance to read it?
Yeah,
Elliot.
I have a question here. I believe in that meeting, we had Will Gartley present his map of existing piers.
Yep.
And there was a discussion about, how many feasible locations remained. And it's my impression that the committee accepted that as fact. And I think that would be appropriate to note in the minutes.
I don't know if I go too far as to fact. I would say that it was fact as presented by Will Gartley, and that we've been pretty careful in this to, he is because he is an expert or has experience in the field, he is presenting data and his research, but it's very much his research. So I think short of commissioning our own survey, which we could do, we are using his data as a reference point, but I wouldn't say that we're accepting it as determined fact, because I think that would.
Okay, so if we're using it as a reference point, I think it would be appropriate to mention in the minutes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah. And actually, I did want to comment on that, Bruce. In the pier ordinance section, it said William Gartley will provide aerial maps of piers in the coastal harbor as he did for the outer harbor. I don't think that's totally accurate, because he provided the Google Earth photos, and that's really all we have. And I think that's all he has. I don't think he is going to create a map like he did, a plan like he did before for the outer harbor. But for the coastal harbor, he sort of said, and we can all do it as well, just go into Google Earth and take pictures, screenshots. But he,
Do you want to strike that?
I would say William Gartley provided aerial, and I wouldn't say maps, I would say aerial screenshots aerial screenshots of piers in the coastal harbor. And then strike the as he did for the outer harbor. Provided. Aerial piers of piers in the coastal harbor, he did for the outer harbor. Any other comments on the minutes? Morning, Richard.
Good morning. Apologies for being late.
Oh, no problem. Any other, if not, do we have a motion on the minutes, please? Someone?
I move that we accept the minutes as amended.
Thank you. Second, anybody? Bob, thank you. Any more discussion? Nope. All those in favor? 1, 2, 3. Bruce, what do you?
Right, voting on that?
Yeah, you were there, even though you created it. 4-0, Mark's gonna abstain because he was not here. But we are psyched you're here today, Mark. Okay. That takes care of the other business. Hopefully you guys all got the documents that I've sent along.
It wasn't really to change the minutes, but just, we talked about the sort of discussion buckets. But at some point, I think, after we have our generic discussion, we need to actually come back and go.
We do.
Through the ordinance.
Bit by bit.
Based on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great, so let's use that as the lead-in, because I think, I thought about that too. Sort of how we're doing this process. And you guys, this is a collaborative, like, tell me if you don't think this is working. I think it is, but we're going through the moratorium as it relates to residential piers, docks, floats, and other structures in the outer and coastal harbors. And we are evaluating it based on those four items: public access, density, habitat, and climate change. And we're evaluating each one, each area, and having kind of a lively discussion about those. But then, once we're done, we need to come up with recommendations, and I think the only way to do that is exactly that, to sort of then say, okay, now we've had the kind of broad discussion free, now we're gonna have to get a little bit more down to brass tacks for each of these.
And the other, that I think was in here, it was discussed that somehow the, I don't know what we call them, the floats that attach to the land are somehow off the books. They may not be regulated now, but I think they will be part of the discussion.
Definitely.
Do we actually think they should be?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yep.
That change would say make them permitted as opposed to.
That's the question. There were two that were approved in the outer harbor, and they were approved basically because they decided they didn't need a permit.
Right.
And
They aren't a pier.
because they weren't a pier, but they were afloat, so blah, blah, blah. We'll get into that whole discussion. So I think that's a conversation that we should have. I think that was another, maybe another impetus for even the moratorium. Not that I want to jump into anybody's heads of what brought it around, but it's a very viable discussion. Documents-wise, so Bruce started creating this outline. It's very much of a draft outline.
Yeah. Started
and-
as an outline, became a draft.
Yeah, it became a
report.
draft. No, it's great. I wanted to circulate it because I just wanted you guys to sort of see the direction that we've gone. Doesn't mean that we will continue in this, exact format, but I do think that's, it's very similar to what we did for the steamboat landing thing. We'll evaluate it on these things and then come up with recommendations, circling back to the ordinance. Because that is at the end of the day, that's what we need to discuss. Let's see, other sort of high-level things before we dive into the minutia. There was a meeting on September 9th, a public hearing on the moratorium. The select board asked me to come. There were just a few people in attendance. One spoke very much in favor of the moratorium and extending it, and another spoke against. in the end, they had a public, that's the public hearing part of it. Select Board discussed it relatively briefly. I mean, I think the meeting was an hour, so maybe a little less. And then did vote to extend the moratorium for another 6 months, another 180 days. So they did ask me if I thought that we would have our work done within those 180 days, and I assured them that we would, so.
So we can spend 5 months doing nothing.
We can,
Right.
right, and we're done. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's kind of, we still have our marching orders there. They did ask, one of the select board members, Allison McKellar, did ask if we had met with anyone from the Conservation Commission in particular. She has someone that I think she's maybe the liaison to the Conservation Commission. And I said, no, we've not reached out beyond this committee, because I don't think that's appropriate at this point. But at some point, we may want to.
What do they cover?
Conservation Commission? I don't really know, Bob. You know,
I guess the point of my
green
question is,
stuff.
Do they, well, that is, are they focused on conserving dirt resources? Or is the harbor as a public natural resource considered part of their thing?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. We should find out, because the other thing, at the beginning of this process, they asked if we would want to consult and involve the planning board. And my initial reaction was, well, no, not at the outset, because we're in the water and in the intertidal zone. However, piers are going to straddle those two, so I think it may become appropriate for us to consult with them as we get closer. But I do feel like we should kind of do our work, at least to create our draft, before we involve other entities, other commissions, et cetera. Hello, Elliot.
We entertained Will Gartley.
Just as an expert in the field, yeah. Yep, just because he was, and because he came, and if you remember, we didn't actually invite him. He was present at those the last two meetings, and because he was there, we sort of started talking to him.
Who asked you that question?
What's that?
Had we involved the Conservation Commission?
Allison McKellar asked me that question.
Why would Allison ask that question if it's not appropriate for us to do that?
Oh, I have no idea. It's her opinion.
I do think in the ordinance, there's a section that says that maybe in the zoning ordinance, it might be in the harbor ordinance as well, that either the harbor committee or the planning board, I don't remember which one, can also seek input on pier applications from the Conservation Commission. I think that's why she probably brought that. I think that's in the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
In there, because it's the same section that says you can seek input and comments from the harbor committee.
Okay. So that's in the zoning ordinance, says that the planning board can seek input from the Conservation
If I
Commission?
recall correctly.
Okay.
yes.
Who is the Conservation Commission? Is this a federal, state?
No,
local?
it's a local committee, just like this one. It's
So it's
a,
a committee.
it's a committee.
They have
It's a
any
town
regulatory
committee.
authority?
No,
No.
they're an advisory committee, just like we are.
They were the origin of the unencapsulated polystyrene ordinance, which,
So here's their commission, their purpose in the town ordinance is shall be to serve as a research advisor and advocacy group on environmental and conservation issues relating to the town.
It's pretty broad.
Sure is.
So I think it's, I
Just
mean,
make a timing suggestion of whether it's the planning board or others, that when we start going through the ordinance or after we've gone through it before we tell anyone what we officially think, if we were changing something, then that might be a time to say, does this affect the planning board review and what do they think?
yep. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think having them involved at this point would, too many cooks in the kitchen. We want to be free with our discussions at this point. Okay, I'm trying to think if there's anything else from that meeting. I don't think so. I think that was pretty much the. Yep. Okay, let's dive in then on where we are with our evaluation and review. I feel as though we have thoroughly covered, the last time, I think we covered density. Well, before I get into that. Yep.
Related to that sort of rethought. The possible additional sites for the, that Will had identified, were any of those what I would call south of the Gilray Pier, or are they all towards Belfast from the Gilray Pier?
I believe one was south of the Gilray Pier. One was between that pier and Steamboat Landing.
Because to me, I realized that we weren't talking about, they weren't asking our opinion directly about the Lyman Morse proposal, but that if there's a dock that's south of Gilray, in other words, between those two, then to analyze, oh, there's no density issue because we're looking out there, without considering what would we think if there was that, if that dock was being built and there was a Lyman Morse Marina, well, that, to me, would change the density discussion. So
Fair enough.
I just wanted to throw that out.
Sure. In terms of the documents that we sent around, so just so we all have sort of all the same things, we did get this letter sent to us by Stephen Hand. Did everybody get that? About kayaking impacts. So I just want to make sure that everybody had all the documents. And then you hopefully all have the Rixon Pier application packet, and then the Sherman Pier, one of them application packet, one for the outer harbor, one for the coastal harbor.
I got a question about the letter.
Yes,
Is
sir.
he representing himself, or is he representing Rockport, the
I-
main sports?
All I know is, what he says here, and he just says that he works there. I don't think that, he does sign it, outdoor program
Right, that's right.
director. I'd be cautious of putting too much on that, you know what I mean? But he certainly has a lot of experience, it sounds like. I thought it was an interesting letter, for sure. Okay, well, I think the best thing to do then today, because I felt that these Army Corps permits and, or applications and DEP applications spoke pretty actively to habitat. I guess I thought that if everybody got a chance to read them, we should talk about what they asked for, because as we said at the last one, we kind of want to say, we want to question, for anything that requires a permit, is the permitting review process sufficient at the state and federal level? And then that will bring in, if a permit is not required, what happens? But let's talk about that.
I have a question for Jeremy. It seems to me that it's obvious that they've tried to put some objectivity on the aesthetic interference type of questions. They refer to a matrix that they apply, which seems very unartistic to me. But what is involved in that matrix, do you know?
I found it.
You refer to the Army Corps permit, I believe.
I think it was-
DEP.
Well, I think it came under the DEP, but they might have been referred, but twice, once that about the aesthetic interference, and I don't know that it had to do with navigation, but it was the aesthetic interference with scenic stuff. And then instead of saying, looks good to us, they talked about under the criteria of the matrix without actually analyzing the matrix. So I'm just curious how they actually define scenic beauty.
I could do some research on that, for you.
So I did a
I believe
little.
it's a DEP.
I did a little research on this to try to find that exact thing, the visual assessment, a visual impact assessment. And I did find one, before we accept it as fact, I want to make sure that it is the right one. But it is Appendix A from the DEP, from the Bureau of Land and Water Quality. So that's why I want to, is that the same one? I would assume it is, because this is in relation to other projects proposed in the shoreland zone. So I'm pretty sure it is. So-
Land and Water issues the permits for NERPA.
And what's that, Jeremy?
Land and Water Bureau issues the NRPA permits.
Okay, so then I'm almost sure,
But
and
they also-
the fact that it's
They
dependent.
were also talking about interfering with the flow of water, which would make me wonder if the Bureau of
That was,
Water is different from beauty.
so,
Same department.
Okay.
so this, they, looking at this Appendix A, the visual impact assessment form, they have sort of three levels they look at: landscape compatibility, scale contrast, and spatial dominance. And then, for instance, in the landscape compatibility, they break it down into visual sub-elements: color, form, line, and texture. Indicators, clues are in color, significantly different color, hue, value, chroma. In form, incompatible two-third dimensional shape with landscape surroundings. Line, incompatible edges, bands, or silhouette lines introduced. Texture, incompatible textural grain, density, regularity, or pattern. And then they rate each of those on a score of 0 to 3, 3 being severe impact, 0 being no impact. And then they tally up that section, you know what I mean? And then they go to scale and contrast, and they say major scale, introduction, intrusion, one of several major scales or major objects in a confined setting, significant object or scale, small object or scale. And same, they rate that as well. And then lastly, the landscape situation and backdrop is the spatial dominance section. They said object activity dominates or is prominent in whole landscape composition, or is prominently situated within the landscape, or dominates landform, water, or sky backdrop. And then again, they rate it, and then when they get all done, they tally the scores, all of that. So it's pretty,
So that raises a question for me. Over in Sherman's Cove, where the pier was approved, they're rebuilding, right now, they're rebuilding the entire shorefront. And they've put a road down to the water. They're taking out what was a cement break wall. And whose preview does that fall under?
so, okay, so you're talking about the Rixon Pier, is that what you're talking about? Jeremy, you have something?
That DEP issues a Natural Resource Protection Act permit for that, as does the code office for shoreline stabilization.
So, and that's got nothing to do with the moratorium?
No.
But it certainly changes what was the proposed pier, because the access elevation to the pier is different, and,
No, that was all, that road that's going down there right now, that's a temporary road just to get down there to do the work. But if you remember during that review, Will said that they will be submitting a permit to our office and NRPA as part of the planning. He mentioned this during the planning board review, to re-stabilize that shoreline and revegetate it. It's all Japanese knotweed right in there, and it's nasty erosion. And they're removing, again, like you said, part of that wall that's there. And they're armoring it and planting. The whole bank's gonna be planted, but the elevations aren't changing based on something that they're doing now as opposed what was approved. And that's what you're
The
thinking.
elevations are not
The elevations
changing?
are not changing, not for
Yeah.
no.
The thing that concerns me a little about are you interrupting?
no, go ahead.
What you just read, I'm thinking about it. I think over the weekend in the Press Herald, there was some Sebago Lake property that just went and redid the world, and without any permits. But it seemed like a lot of what they were describing was the photograph looking back at the property, and does it fit in, as opposed to looking out from various places so that you're actually capturing what the pier does, in this case, to the harbor, and to views that people might have, or just the aesthetic of the harbor. And I can think of piers that are angled certain ways, and you say, well, now I gotta look through that pier to see out to the great beyond. So I'm not sure, I mean, I understand, because I do remember when I had these cases many, many moons ago, it was so subjective as to, beauty in the eye of the beholder, but that just seemed very engineering oriented, so.
Well, I think part of where that's addressed in our ordinance is the open sides. You can't have enclosed rails on the pier, and I think, that was the attempt to address that factor.
Well, if, I'll just do a crazy example that won't happen, but someone applied for a pier coming straight out from Curtis Island towards the ledges, and then it wouldn't matter really whether there were open sides or not. It would be a pier across, going out across the entrance to Camden Harbor, and everyone who tried to come in and out would have to put up with it. So that's, I guess, what I'm wondering, is that really captured there when it's talking about such sort of technical terms?
I mean, I think they're trying to be as objective as they can in that, in coming up with those criteria, though we can certainly ask if, it's a debatable question whether or not there's enough in there. You know what I mean?
Well, and I guess I'd have to look at that. Was that in the, at the end of the documents we got, or did you find that
I
somewhere
found that
else?
separately.
Okay.
That's why, but, before we finish, we need to make sure that is the right one, is
Yeah.
the only
Well,
appendix.
I guess I'd like to have it verified that when they're talking, I say matrix, because that's what it sounds, criteria, whatever, that we've actually looked at them, because if it was that, I'm not sure that it would cover the horrible hypothetical of the dock coming off Curtis Island,
Yeah,
or Dillingham Point, or what.
The problem is you pretty much have to quantify something, or else it's just somebody's opinion versus somebody else's opinion.
Well, even those things sort of, they're breaking it down, but they
Yeah.
still don't have, some mathematical engineering number. It's just, I don't know. It struck me as, I don't know, trying so hard, but are they still getting anything?
Right. I was pleased that they had something, put it that way. It was a little more in-depth than I thought it was going to be. But is it perfect? That's definitely debatable. Okay, well, let's keep it focused today, well, for now, at least, on the habitat aspect, because that was one of the big ones that we talked about last time. And I just think we can kind of close the loop on it a little bit. Did you all go through this? I made a few notes. Again, maybe I'm easy. I was impressed by the level of, not just review, but critical review, that they did at both the DMR and the IF&W level, for the NERPA applications. Thoughts, anyone?
Yeah, I concur with that. I think it's more than adequate.
Yeah, it's quite extensive. I had like 4,
Yeah.
5 different committees that have to do, that reviewers had to do specifically with all different parts of the habitat, whether it's soil erosion.
Right, and the shading, they talked about
Shading, yeah.
how many square feet of shading. I was like, wow. And I guess what I liked about it was that it was not a black and white, that they said, okay, there is an impact.
Right.
You know what I mean? They sort of accepted, there is an impact that comes from this, but is it unreasonable? Is it, I think that's the term that they used throughout. But they had a basis for what is reasonable and what is unreasonable. So they actually did quantify that term. And they looked at alternatives. They required them to look at alternatives before even proceeding, if you will. Yeah, they said, okay, you want a pier, why can't you use something else that is already there? Or is there another place where you can put it, et cetera, which I thought was interesting.
I think they also have expertise. So it's not just writing down stuff. Right. But the staff there have expertise that, no offense, Jeremy, it's not gonna be found locally or locally on many committees, and if you do, then it's, I don't know,
It seems
I
as though
think
there's
he
been-
does an intensive job with people that, if anything, are gonna overprotect, not underprotect.
Yeah.
And we've had, I mean, this committee seems as though they've had a comfort level up to this point with the information that's been provided in our past reviews of permit applications. So has anything changed? I mean,
Right.
we're pretty comfortable with it previously. It seems comprehensive. Nothing's really changed. Can we continue to be comfortable with it? I mean, I think.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't have any problem with the natural resources, you know,
yeah, you got some, I mean, we got
Yeah.
fisheries.
grass, et cetera, analysis, fish, the impact on it. They do,
They do a really good job,
yeah,
maybe even too good.
yeah.
Well, and it was interesting, even this was the Micmac Nation review suggested, for instance, this was in the Rixon Pier project, that if the wetland disturbances required mitigation, they asked that they use this black ash as the principal species, which I was like, wow. So they're actually suggesting this particular tree, because it has significance in the culture of the tribes, et cetera. Then they go on to say, some people don't like this, so that's kind of an interesting debate. But anyway, my point is just that brings in a whole nother perspective. And I think it's notable that but all the tribes said in their reviews, if you discover inadvertently through the excavation process anything, you need to stop so that we can get in there and figure out what it is and deal with it appropriately. So, again, that's another level and perspective that I was pretty impressed by. And I'm pleased that it is required I don't know if it's required, I guess it is, by the state.
It was in one of the applications, not in both of them.
I think it's in both of them.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. I guess they're having some trouble with our mics, but our mics are on. Yeah. I'm getting a text that the mics need to be on. Everybody's mics are on, right? Thompson's off, but that's all right. That's just one. I don't know. Anyway, I guess speak up when you're speaking, I guess. They said they can't hear us on the Zoom. Sophie is looking very sad that she cannot hear us on the Zoom.
At all?
At all. She can't hear us at all. She's muted. All right, let's just pause for one moment, please.
I'm here.
Okay, yeah. You can't,
I'm here.
but you can't hear us.
I can hear you very well. I hear muffled sounds, like Muppet sounds in the background.
Huh, okay.
Can you hear this, Sophie?
Are you using the owl?
No.
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 Just-
Does everybody have mics?
Yep, and they're all on.
So you need to speak very close to the mics.
Mark, do your test again, Mark.
Can you hear me now, Sophie?
No. Okay, so,
Very close to the mic. Oh, there's one that's broken also, but very close to the mic. I should be able to hear you.
Mark
swallowed his.
Mark almost swallowed his mic just now, and you couldn't hear it, so that's interesting. Maybe grab that other one, Mark, and see if it's that one.
Sophie, can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear me now?
that's Bob Perkins, right?
The first one was,
Sorry.
Try that one, Mark.
Can you hear me, Sophie?
That's very muffled.
What's the echo?
Yeah, I think it has something to do with the echo.
Testing.
Wow. No, she's not
I
hearing
hear
it.
the echo.
Anything here?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm going to keep on listening, and then whatever comes through, it's good for me anyway to be there. And if you need me ping me, Josh.
Okay.
I'm here.
We'll,
Jim just tested positive for COVID-19, so I'm.
oh, bummer.
Sometimes.
Oh, bummer. Sorry to hear that. Yeah, okay, no worries. All right, yeah, just text me or yell or wave your arms if you want to participate. Okay, so then let's talk more about the habitat. Is there anything more that is not included in the DEP review and / Army Corps review, because it's two-part, that we feel should be included from a habitat standpoint?
I think we've all stated that they do a very thorough, professional job.
Yep.
Yep.
And they're certainly above our expertise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I sat there and tried to find, like, well, what could they be missing? But then it's just, I'm not a scientist, I don't know what we might be missing. Whereas, as I think you said, somebody said they maybe even overdo it sometimes, which is not a bad thing necessarily.
Well, there's so many committees reporting on habitat.
Yeah.
They're,
Be focused
duplicating
on it.
effort quite a bit.
All right, so then,
With that, that raises the question of, like, what is this moratorium really all about?
well, we're not going to go there. We've been asked to look at it.
Public access
yeah.
and climate change left.
Yeah. All right, so then, are we in agreement that the permitting, the reviews required as a result of the permitting at the state and federal level, at this committee, we find that's sufficient? I think.
Is this something we should vote on?
We're going to go back and vote on it.
I think
on
we have a
everything.
Quaker consensus on it.
But we have a Quaker
Quaker
consensus, yeah.
Okay.
So I think we can move on. We're going to go back and vote on everything when we're
Yep,
done.
okay.
So that we make it all sort of official. Great, we'll check that one off then. Let's move on to public access, and I am pleased that Mr. Kelly is here to talk, because I met with Bill Kelly, the town attorney, after our last meeting, just to talk a little bit about public access, because there was some question about what is the public access right to the intertidal zone, and this is a big topic that can go a long ways. But do you want me to recap my understanding of our conversation, and then you can correct me when I'm wrong?
Have you guys already had a chance to go around about this in this committee?
Yeah, we talked about it.
Well, only that we don't really know what the current status is.
Okay. Do you want me to hold a microphone, or they just, would we figured out they're useless?
This one works.
Well, grab that.
Well,
And there works.
we know this one
But you might
works.
speak, Bob, so I'll.
The upshot was, we, as a result of this, Bill, we wanted to determine what is the existing status of the public's, right to access, this committee's domain, if you will, which is the harbor, and as it relates to the harbor, the intertidal zone. That's sort of where our purview stops. My understanding is, obviously, from the low tide line out, meaning the water, is held in state trust, so that is public area, managed by the town, et cetera. So that would be the harbor, per se, the floating water. Where it gets a little funky is we have these public access points that come into the harbor across the intertidal zone. What then? And, we discussed at the last meeting that if you come through one of those and you turn left, do you have a right, first of all, to walk along the water, in the intertidal zone? I think we all agreed, no, you don't have a right to do that as a member of the public. But then, isn't there, I think this was the discussion, there's the fishing, fouling, and navigation clause. So if I've got a fishing rod with me, am I allowed to then walk along those areas? That's the point that's being litigated, I think, continually. But my understanding, this is where I hope you'll chime in, is that we do have a certain right to the fishing and fouling and navigation in the intertidal zone. How do I say this? But that could be abused. That you explained to me that sort of dates back to, common law, way back. And that it was done because that was a way for people to literally get their food, was to work along the shore there. It does not mean that I can walk along there with a broken fishing rod. And there, so is that correct? And then, so yeah, did I summarize that correctly?
Yeah, I think you've got the gist of it. The intertidal zone between high and low water is privately held in Maine, and it's subject to, as you described, this thing called a public trust, because a king of England said so in the 1640s, and the state of Maine has decided to respect that, and the state has kept it, the law court has kept it, and actually that was an ordinance, at least that's how it's referenced and how it was issued by the king of England. And the state of Maine law court has respected that repeatedly, and there have been multiple opportunities in the last, I think since 88, 89, with what's called the Moody Beach case. There have been several others. It's been teed up by a couple of Superior Court justices for the law court to take a really hard look at it, with some really detailed opinions about why, at the Superior Court level, the public trust should be expanded for recreational uses, something other than fishing, fouling, and navigation. And the law court has basically refused to go there repeatedly. Recently reversed itself or clarified itself in an opinion after it went a little further than it had in the past, and then sort of pulled back a bit. I think on the premise that, hey, law court, you can't just change these rights because people have been buying waterfront property for several hundred years in Maine, understanding what their rights are, and you have to be really cautious here. And the law court, I think, has bought that argument and has not expanded the scope of the public trust. And as Josh has described, it's really interesting. I don't know if you guys have ever had a chance to look at this book called Liberty Men and the Great Proprietors. But if you like to read about history and history of the water and uses of water in Maine and how important it's been, this is a great book by a professor from the University of California. And he focuses on Waldo and Knox counties and how they came into being and how important waterways were for a variety of the things you've just described, because they were the highways then. They were waterways, but they were how commerce moved and how people had access to food. And original divisions in most of the waterfront towns in Maine would have specifically provided access points that were public access points to the water because they were that important in terms of the original divisions when folks called proprietors, private entities, came and chopped up pieces of the state of Maine and created municipalities. Anyway, it's all sort of, it ties together. But what you have here is a conflict of private rights, somebody who owns the flats being impacted by public use. And it can happen over a sufficient period of time that those public rights can turn into legal rights because people went at it long enough and in a particular way. Because public easements can be created over time in roads and other areas, but those are the rare, really rare cases and difficult to prove because there's already this public trust that allows people to carry a clam hod and clam or to fish or to shoot ducks that's already there. So there's permission for that in a sense because that's not contrary to the private interest that's already established because that's what the colonial ordinance said. So how does the public as a group of people acting in a particular way get more rights by showing continuous activity for a 20-year period in a way that was not consented to? It's really hard. So very, very rarely would something like Camden Harbor or Sherman Cove be subject to, would a private property owner be subject to a claim that public rights had expanded to also allow X, Y, or Z? If it was configured differently, it could be a road. If people used the intertidal area, if it was proper macadam or some base, they could drive on it. That happens in other places. But we don't have that here. We have pretty much walking. That would be about it in terms of how one would establish additional public rights. So all that to say, it's a private matter at its core in terms of the flats are owned privately. And then if someone is offending the property owner, they typically are going to deal with calling the sheriff or the police department and say, this person is trespassing. And their defense would be, I've got a fishing pole. And the owner would say, yeah, but you got a book and a lounge chair, and you just stuck that pole in the ground, and you're not really fishing. So, then it's a factual issue of what are they doing, and do they have the right to be there? And that's a difficult thing for the Harbor Committee to address, because we are really talking about private rights and trespass by particular individuals is how these things tend to present themselves. Somebody's confronting, a property owner is confronting someone who keeps walking on their beach or reading a book or whatever, and they say, get off my property. And that's how these cases, you read them, that's sort of how they start. And then the court gets into pretty much the analysis I just described. So that's the colonial ordinance in a nutshell. It's very well known. It applies to great ponds. You guys don't deal with that much, but it's interesting. People don't know, but any body of water over 10 acres is considered a great pond typically. There's some other exceptions to that, and owned by the state of Maine. And you can actually walk through private property to get to great ponds, as long as you don't go through the improved area of somebody's house, the curtilage they call it. But if there are woods, you can get to a great pond and you can not be stopped. Private property owners don't tend to know that, but it is true.
Bill, can you talk a little bit about, we talked about the public access points in Camden, and I don't want to go too.
Can I ask one question first?
Yep.
The discussion about the flats and all, that's really as long as they're uncovered by water. But as soon as the tide comes in, the kayaker has a right to come in on the water over what would be unwalkable.
That would be navigation.
Right.
We talked a little bit about the public access points. We've got these handful of public access, or more than a handful, in Camden, Steamboat Landing and, Marine Avenue and all of this. I'm curious how that relates to getting to the water. Is that a public access to the water, or is it a public access to a view of the water? And can you talk a little bit, because you mentioned that it depends on how the roadway was actually first platted or something, like way back in the day?
So think about things this way, that what's called the upland, which is a piece of land to roughly the shore line, which might be a bluff, it might be sort of where the high water mark is, but sort of the end of land. They call that upland in Maine common law, in the case law. Usually the flats convey with the upland. So when you buy a piece of property that's on the water, depending how the deed was written, it's most likely that the upland owner also owns the intertidal area between high and low water. The same thing can happen with a road, a public road, if that road is owned in fee by the municipality. And we call these rangeways frequently in Maine because of how the land was divided back. I mentioned the proprietors, which were typically the private entities that came up and cut up an area that then became a municipality. So in certain instances, and I haven't come across any yet in Camden, but we certainly, I've come across them in other municipalities. If the road is owned in fee, which means the same way you own your home, you get a deed, you have all the rights subject to maybe some restrictions, but otherwise you own all the rights in that land. A road can be owned the same way by a municipality. And if it does own it that way, if that's how it was sort of historically derived, then likely the municipality owns the intertidal area that is adjacent to that road. So that would also be sort of public land, so to speak. Alternatively, and most of the time, public ways are easements. They're not owned in fee by the municipality. They're taken in a variety of ways, but typically they're taken once upon a time, and damages are paid to the property owner over which that road was laid. And that's all you get. You get what you pay for. And typically it was just the town paid for an easement. And those roadways typically have a terminus at the shore. And they're usually written that way. So that's where they end. And it's just an easement to that end point. So the long answer, I guess, to that question is that in those situations, which is most of the time, depending on where the boundary lines were when the road was laid out, that private property owner owns under the road, or typically to the center line of the road, and would also own the intertidal area as well. And that intertidal area would not be burdened by a public easement in the form of the road, because that's what it wasn't paid for. It's pretty rare that a municipality would take a road to low water. It's possible, but I've never seen a description like that. And that would have been at the time the road was created, the easement was created. Where did they stop it? Did they stop at the shore? And make it clear that way, and I'm using the word shore, which has a bunch of meanings in Maine law, but you know what I mean when I say the shore. I mean where you get to the water, when you first hit it at high tide, roughly. So that's the breakdown of what are the rights. Practically speaking, people walk down a public easement, a public road, and they get to the shore where the high water line is. They will continue on, and they can do that for those purposes of the public trust easement I described, which is fishing, fouling, and navigation, because you just get to there and you keep going, because that intertidal area is burdened with that public trust. But not for recreational uses. That's not yet been determined by the law court.
About, you go down one of these roads, the easement is wide enough to allow someone to park along the side of it at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Take their kayak off the top and carry it to low water.
Mm-hmm.
Is that part of the public right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe
Well, depending on,
Even if you don't own the fee in the flats.
Right, no, I think if you were carrying a kayak across flats, I think that sounds to me like navigation.
Okay.
That's part of it.
But sitting down enjoying the view is not, depending on what type of, do you happen to know of the our 3 access points around Sherman Cove or around the outer harbor? Do you know how they're configured for the town?
My understanding is they're all easements. They're not owned in fee.
Okay.
We had litigation over Marine Ave a few years ago. I was very deep into that. We have surveys for that. And there's also a survey
Which is Marine Ave.
going out on the right. It would be, what, going
By
up High
Norumbega.
Street? It's the second or third on the right? Third on the right?
What about the one that's closest to Wayfair? And I noticed that there's benches. at the
that's Eaton Avenue.
Eaton Ave. Do you know?
I believe it's a public easement. I'd have to check, but I'm not aware of any fee.
I'm not sure too many people will want to go over the top of their kayak.
Right, a lot of them have logistical challenges, yeah.
But I just remember that there are some benches sitting there.
That could be part of the road that's above the low tide mark,
Oh, yeah, right.
So I
above
have
the
a
high tide
question.
mark.
I mean, if you have, you're a property owner, and you own to the water, if you have a float or debris or a boat that washes up onto your beachfront, are you then the responsible owner of that property and have to dispose of it?
I don't know of any duty that says that, but if it's lobsterman's gear, you better not dispose of it, because they'll find you. But I don't know of any obligation to. I suppose there could be an argument on some level that if you don't if you don't take control of it and it floats away and it damaged somebody else's property, they'd claim that you created a nuisance, but I just don't think I don't think there's no duty I know of for debris that washes up. It washes up and
Usually
it
litter at that point.
washes out.
What about a boat?
I,
Your boat comes ashore on my property? I'm selling it.
Then it's an issue of, then it becomes purview of admiralty law.
Yeah,
Because
where's
that
Sandy?
boat, Once it is not attached to either a mooring or an anchor, then salvage rights apply.
Yeah, I don't know. Sandy would. I know a funny story I heard once of a minister in Jamaica who was giving a service, and the way the church was situated, the pulpit looked out to the water, and the minister could see that a boat had crashed and that various items of value were starting to wash. And he instructed the congregation to keep looking up at the cross while he slowly moved his way out down the aisle, because the exit door was there. And once he got to the exit, he ran to the shore and could gather as much stuff as he could, because under their law, if you can pick it up, you own it. So that's as much as I know about admiralty law.
I just want to finish what I was talking about. The 3 public access points that we were talking about in the Sherman's Cove discussion are only accessible for fishing, fouling, or navigation. So you can't go down there and sit and enjoy the view.
You can, on the easement,
Right, but you can't go down among the rocks and look for sea glass or something like that.
well.
You shouldn't
no,
anyway.
Right, no, because it's not fishing, fouling, or
Right,
navigation.
I just wanted to make sure that was,
Yeah, the core of your question really is, when the easement was taken, what was the scope of it for the road? And typically, they were taken for what they called highway purposes. And that's a term both in statute and in common law. And that would include, as it's interpreted today, an area for the pedestrian to rest. So that's why, without trying to pick a fight with anybody who owns next to a public way that goes right to the shore, who doesn't want, frequently don't want to have people congregating there. But under the definition of highway purposes, to answer your question, why is there a bench there? Because it's probably permitted under the scope of what was originally taken.
yeah, well, a bench is usually above the high tide mark. I'm talking about the intertidal zone.
No, and yeah, I'm drawing a line there, no.
Yeah.
Benches in intertidal area would not be okay.
So I think what's important for us, though, in terms of the public access, because I think we want to be a little careful that we don't do the public access review that I think the town is going to do, that Elliot referenced in the non-agenda items section. But for us, public access is especially obviously in the water, as you pointed out. Or Bob pointed out, when the high tide comes in, then we do have public access via boat or kayak or whatever it might be as a navigation
Can I answer
thing.
one more question? That's only slight, I'm just curious. When the property owner's line does not come perpendicular to the high tide, it's running at an angle, you own the flats in front of you, do you own the flats on that angle, or is it perpendicular to where you hit the shore?
It's a complicated question, because it implies you have to apply something called the colonial method of determining the littoral lines between properties. And that includes, if you think about over time, a larger lot gets cut into smaller lots. It includes understanding where the edges of the larger lots were once upon a time, and the configuration of the shoreline to create tie lines, and then perpendicular lines from the tie lines which cross.
Okay, enough.
It's a fascinating thing for
As soon as he
surveyors.
said complicated, I knew this
He
could
said
go on
littoral,
for a
I was like,
long
oh, there we
time.
go.
We're dealing with two lawyers
We're in
here.
trouble.
I find it very interesting, and I've been involved in many lawsuits over people thinking, I just get to continue with my boundary line, which goes this way, so I get most of the flats.
Right.
That's not how it works.
But I think, and this is a little bit how we get to this letter from Stephen Hain, because the public does have a right to navigation in the harbor. including over the intertidal zone, if you're in a small vessel. That being said, that public access, how do I say this, that navigation actually can be impacted by the presence of piers, floats, and other structures. So that's where I think it does become sort of relevant for us and for our review, is to say, well, okay, you have the right to be in this area, what is the impact? You know, that's like when we've talked about other piers, okay, you had to go out 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet, whatever the number is. How did that impact you? Was it a significant impact? Could it be mitigated? Blah, blah, blah.
Right. And is it negative or a positive impact?
There's the interesting thing I thought was.
Just the word impact does not
Exactly.
necessarily connotate that it's negative.
Correct. And in his case, he is saying, I believe, basically, not to paraphrase, but that in some cases, these things actually provide a benefit to navigation by providing a refuge during bad
Safe
weather,
harbor,
you know, et cetera. So I thought that was a really, I guess my whole point in saying that is to say, public access and free access is not quite as black and white as one might think initially. You know what I mean? That there is a potential benefit. And does the benefit, I guess there's the question, does the benefit outweigh the impact? The negative impact. Yeah, exactly. All right. So what else on public access? How do we, like, now let's just talk about it after Bill's given us our treatise on colonial law. And no, it's great. I think it's super useful and important. How do we feel that the existing ordinances, we're not going to vote on this, which is discussion, but properly address the public access implications of new piers, docks, and other structures?
The only thing I can think of is that going under the piers, like Steve said, is fun, and you can get access behind the piers, maybe not at low tide, at high tide, because you don't have enough room under the piers. So, I mean, the only thing would think of to lift the piers.
I was going to say, that would be a way to mitigate the impact, I guess, is to say, well, if you raised the piers, then there's full tide,
Full
access.
tide
Even at
access
high
under
tide,
them.
you can slide under.
And when I was reading this, they said the height of the piers is 6 feet.
6
I thought
feet.
it was 8 feet. but
6
it's
in the
only
outer
6
harbor.
feet. Okay,
Yeah, I believe that's the case.
and 10 feet out.
And 10 feet in
coastal.
the outer, in the coastal harbors, right?
Well, some of these things blend together, like, there's the physical access, can you get under it, do you have to go around it, et cetera, and then there's the purpose you're out there for, and Steve might be out there for one purpose, entertaining people who don't know what they're doing in kayaks and want to see Camden Harbor and all the rest of it, and other people may want to be out there being as natural as possible. And so is that a beauty thing or a physical access thing or what? But just for me personally, some of that question kind of comes back to the peeve of, I think at the very least, we should be recommending that no part of any dock can be closer than 300 feet to any part of any other dock, not this 300 feet as you walk around a moon. And then the question might be, well, is 300 feet far enough apart? But there's a certain distance where, it's not that big a deal. So to me, it sort of becomes part of density as opposed to, well, how high should it be? Is it really a matter of physically being able to accomplish getting under it or whatever?
Well, I think it blends, it does blend, some of the items blend to each other. I think from a public access standpoint, when you're talking about piers, docks, and floats, you're really only talking about small craft. You're not going to take anything significant unless we changed the the rules drastically, but I mean, piers right now.
The question then would be, why do you want to take your whaler or your center console in there anyway?
Yeah.
You know, you're actually, the kayaker would be complaining about the center console coming in there.
Right. So you'd be impacted on both sides.
I mean, can we look at items 4 and 5 on the moratorium? And, I mean, if we read through both of those, you know, where it says that all of these things may adversely affect small recreational boating and access to a substantial degree. That's the claim that's being made.
To a substantial.
To a substantial degree. And we are debating this and saying, well, I don't know. I mean, we got the guy's letter. He had his opinion. We have our opinions.
We're also looking at the impact of
You know, I don't know if
potential of
there's a
4 new
big,
piers.
Under the existing rules, yes.
Right, but that's
Yeah.
what we're operating under the existing rules
Right.
unless we recommend new ones.
Right, right. The question that's being asked is, are they sufficient? Are the existing
Is
rules?
the public access substantially affected
Yeah.
by these 4
it may
potential? 4
adversely
new piers?
affect. And then the next one is, it may interfere with public access. It may. Well, yeah, it may. And is that a reason for us to have to make an ordinance change?
Well, I don't think it's just the 4 new piers, it's also the existing 4 piers added to.
To the existing.
And like I say, I can certainly see where, let's forget Camden for a minute, but a number of docks going ding, 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 ding with floats and rowboats, it's just gonna make people say, I'm not taking my kayak in there, and I used to like it. But I don't know where the density
line
level is that you just, because one dock, then you go back to substantially, is it that big a deal to deal with one dock in an entire stretch?
Right.
I was down at Eaton Point within the last couple of days, the terminus, and I looked up and I looked down and I tried to imagine 2 new piers to the left and 1 to the right. And there's a lot of space there. To me, it doesn't seem like it would impact very much, and it wouldn't aesthetically or anything. That's just
But that's just
my
one,
opinion.
yeah, that's just. Well, I think because I do want to get to the last item on our review criteria, if you will. But in terms of how I think we've quantified what the public access impacts are of new piers, docks, floats, and other structures. Meaning there is, the impact is not in going, how do I say this, is not in going left, is not when you come down to the water and turn into the left. We've just determined that you don't have a presumptive right except for fishing, fouling, and navigation in that. There is an impact, though, of these new piers, docks, and floats in navigation. There is an impact. It could be negative, it could also be positive.
But it's, in the ordinance, is a significant, is there a significant impact?
Yeah.
Currently addressing it
So if you
anyway.
have, how many boats do we have in the harbor? Say,
A couple hundred or something, yeah.
1,000 boats, and it impacts 2 boats?
Right.
It's not very significant, is it?
Well, it's probably not impacting the boats on moorings.
Right.
And I must say, I guess I haven't been there enough in the last couple of years, but I was stunned, the number of at Steamboat Landing, the number of, kayaks, small rowboats that are now using those
The
metal
Yep.
slats that, for a long time, those things went there and 1 or 2 people used them. So
Yeah,
it is increasing.
Yeah, there sure are.
All right, well, I feel like we've pretty much covered public access in terms of our review, unless
Do
anybody,
we want to come up with an opinion that, or are we going to wait on that?
I think we're going to wait on that. I think, I'm a little leery of coming up with opinions. I know, for instance, Bob has a strong one on the density issue. And that's a good one.
Yeah.
I don't want to bring those until we kind of circle back around and look at them all, because they do all.
Interact with each other.
Interact, yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
An understanding.
We've come up with an understanding, and we're sort of laying the groundwork, the basis for our future votes and discussion. But so then the last one is climate change, and that's, I think, obviously the biggest one. I'm sort of bummed that I put it on the last item on this list. But that's the one that I do feel like we can actually do something. If there is an emergency, that's it. And climate change obviously encompasses so many things. It encompasses storm surge, it encompasses stronger and more frequent storms, and it encompasses sea level rise, just to, name a couple. So the big question is, we've all reviewed now 2 piers ourselves and approved them. We've reviewed the federal and state level permitting required for those same piers. Do we feel that, I'm going to ask the question right off the bat then, do we feel that our ordinances adequately address climate change in its, do they adequately address climate change?
Depends on your frame of reference. I think yesterday before I read something, and I believe it was referring to Maine, that people that are meant to know what they're talking about were predicting a 4 or 5 foot rise between 2050 and 2100, which stunned me. And it doesn't stun me because I ain't gonna have to deal with it. But to realize that grandchildren, this is their lifetimes. So, the ordinance applies to things that are applied for now, but those things are gonna be there a long time. And I suspect, and I can't remember exactly where Will came down on this, but I think that the ordinance probably does not take into account flexibility of even things that are appropriate now. Can they be somehow modifiable?
Right.
35, 40 years from now, because I know all sorts of private piers that are 50, 100 years old. They might have had new wood on them, but they've been around a long time.
And I mean, these ordinances that dictate piers have been modified over the years, but we could go back, and perhaps we should go back and figure out when the 6-foot criteria, for instance, in the Outer Harbor came into play. When was that established? And what has been the sea level rise change since then? I think we're probably going to see it's somewhat significant. Because I've seen it, I think Will Gartley said it, at high tide, the existing piers in the Outer Harbor are right up to it. The water is right up to the gangways, whatever we call it, the piers.
He said
At some times.
At some times, right, not every
what do you
tide.
call it? The
spring tides and all that.
the year high.
The highest
high tide.
annual tide.
Yeah, highest annual tide.
But
Yeah.
if you go to North Haven, for example, the casino, the yacht club there, I don't remember it being this way 50 years ago, but you go out at a high tide now, and you couldn't float an oh-boy under it.
Yeah.
That's a little teeny thing we played with as kids, 6 inches high maybe. There's almost no gap. So there's already been a significant change, but it's bit by bit by bit.
So on this change, does that affect low tide also? So I guess my question is, if our tide range is 12 feet, does our tide range then become 14 feet if sea level rises 2 feet?
No.
Or does it remain 12 feet and it's just,
Right, low
My understanding
tide
is
will be
it's-
higher, high tide will be higher.
They do not know that yet.
yeah?
They have not made a conscious effort to really look at low tide.
You're saying while we can tell that the high tides have gotten higher, have the low tides gotten lower? Is the question.
My point is, without actually knowing that, you can say, okay, we'll increase the height of the piers, to 8 feet or 10 feet. But that also increases the length of the ramp you need. So,
Yep.
But
That's a
I-
great
what
point,
I'm-
actually.
What I'm talking about more is, is it like a performance standard? So it's not that we are pretending that we're gonna know what height it needs to be in 2100 now, as opposed to, we want all new docks built in a way
That they can be
the
retrofit.
owners can, the next time they replace the platform, it's easy to add and take care of it, and not have people that are just having docks that, and I don't know, the worst case scenario, what happens, what we're worried about, and why who we're protecting from what. But the bottom line is, you don't want to be encouraging people to build docks that are going to be
Destroyed
destroyed and
and wash up on Mark's lawn or beach.
all the way to Mark's lawn.
Will said last time that both cribbing and piles can be raised, piles to a certain extent with caps.
Right.
Okay, that was, because I thought I heard two different things on two different days. One, that the piles were a problem, and then the second time, I heard what you were saying, that there was some modified.
Some modification, I don't know how much.
Right, but it was limited.
Yeah.
The capping of the piling, you can do it up to a certain height, and then they become unstable. Whereas the cribbing that supports the pier, you
just
can
add
lift the
another
pier and
layer of
just
blocks.
add more blocks, and yeah, it's like, Lincoln Logs. But I think the greater issue is not so much, sea level rise is important, but the severity of the storms is going to have more of an impact on us in the shorter term. Because that's happening right now. And evidence of that is the hurricane that's going to hit Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, which is unprecedented in how many years? 100 years? So Fiona's going to do terrible damage to, these storms are becoming so severe that our shoreline's going to be impacted more from the severity of the storms and the surge that affects Camden Harbor long before the sea level rise.
Right, sea level rise is happening, but
I
it's,
just want to have this conversation because
Right.
we are going to jinx ourselves.
Yeah, if the Army Corps,
We haven't had a hurricane
if the
since
Army Corps in their
Gorbachev was
wisdom
almost
would ever
overthrown.
see fit
But-
to do that breakwater, it would be a tremendous asset to this harbor.
yeah, what you're saying is that the sea level rise,
Is it?
I think is happening. I think we can all see that, but it is in general, on a day-to-day or month-to-month, it's an incremental, sort of smaller, whereas a storm surge,
Right,
which
I
is
think
due
in the
to
next
that, you're going to
25
see
years, we'll
quick
see catastrophic damage from
storm surge.
storm surge.
Yeah.
Whereas it may be 100 years before we see the same.
I would agree with that. And you're already seeing
Work
it.
together, because if the tide's high, if the thing's high.
Yeah, so when you combine the two things happening,
Right.
But
But you're already seeing it in the damage that they're seeing at Steamboat Landing and things
Right.
like that. We're already seeing more damage.
Yeah.
Yes, Steamboat Landing is not
Shaky,
in,
but
not in the
still.
robust state it was when
Some
it
of
was
that can
first
be
built.
age-related as
Some of
well.
it is definitely age-related, but I think, and we could talk to Steve, I think it's pretty clear that
Yeah.
it gets beat up a lot more than it used to.
I'm not quite sure if that's within the scope of our
Well, I think it's a
discussion,
really good point, though, in terms of the climate change
but thinking
piece.
about, wow, what can we do to make sure that these piers,
Right, they can be raised, but should they
Right.
all just, should they all be made out of granite? Should they all be made out of, titanium? I don't know what
I don't know.
material is. You know what I mean?
Right.
But should they all be constructed in a way that they are more robust than what is currently required in the ordinance?
yeah, but I go back to your thinking that,
Hello, Sophie.
Hi. So I think this is the heart of the matter. And maybe what we need to do is to find cities that are facing, coastal cities who are facing the same thing, who have written ordinances with recommendations to raise or use material that are an examples. I think we're not the first ones thinking about this. Maybe I can try to look through MMA. But I think there's and ask a few environmental also organizations we work with on the river, like I'm dealing with that too, to see if there are examples that we could, use to illustrate what other coastal towns are doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can do that.
Okay.
Josh, I'm curious, I have a vague memory of Wayfair sort of redoing its wharf platform a number of years ago.
The wharf platform was rebuilt at some point, when it was built, basically, I think back in 2003, 2005, and then we just rebuilt it.
So they rebuilt it, they didn't raise it?
Now we raised it, yeah. We raised it.
Raised it.
The new one raised it, yes. The new construction raised it.
It's just happening?
It's just happened, yep.
And how much did you raise it?
I should know that. I want to say it's 2 feet.
I want to say 2 feet, too.
Yeah, I think it's 2 feet. Yep.
We probably both heard the same number from the same
Was that
place.
based on any, because someone had been intellectually curious over the last 40 years and taken measurements of what you considered high?
That is because we saw what was coming, and saw that the tides were rising, and said, if we're going to make this sort of an investment.
But not with a hard number.
Not with a hard number.
Yeah.
No. Excuse me 1 second.
Tom, were you going to talk before Sophie?
I was going to say that I
1
agree
second.
that maybe it's not, we may not be in a position to say specifically you should use this kind of material, or you should use this, or it should be that height, because those are unknown. And the technology that's going to be available 5 years from now may not even be something we have on our radar. So the language we might want to use is that taking into consideration sea level rise, additional surge, that whatever construction is going to occur is able to be retrofit to meet the concerns going forward. I don't know I can't say you should use granite or you should use titanium. I don't know what you should use.
So if we created a clause that said, is this pier being built on the best current technology
Today.
to compensate for future sea level rise?
Mm-hmm. And that the construction is such that it allows for future retrofitting to accommodate additional surge or.
Right, I think that it's not just the current.
And leave it
events,
sort of.
It's that
Right.
we don't know. So
Right.
to some extent, and we don't know when this application is going to be, now or 20 years from now.
Right.
But the board that's approving it at that point should be taking into account that it needs to be retrofittable.
Exactly. And that's practical language that I think is more reflective of our thinking.
Well, when I referenced current, I meant current technology.
Right.
For,
Yeah.
It's a little ambiguous, but it also,
Well, it's interesting because
Josh.
if we really got more storms, and
who knows what's going to
these
happen.
storms are hard because they're also we're more aware of it because of cable TV and media and et
Right.
cetera. It's not on some newspaper page, it's right in front of you with photos. But I look at docks that are exposed to a lot of waves, and they have minimal plant in the ground. They're not fighting the waves, they're avoiding them. Just let them wash right through you.
Yeah.
There's a couple on the Camden side of North Haven that are fully exposed, and they have got almost nothing that touches rock.
Yeah.
One or two posts,
And they just let the water
and the
come
water
through.
just comes around. And so, the float is a float, but when the float comes out, one of them's on the on the Oak Hill edge of Webster Head. It's just literally like one stanchion down, I think, with the idea that there's nothing to bang against. So, you know, I could see someone, if it really got horrible, like the maritime equivalent of the California fires, that people might say, well, we're going to have totally different philosophy here because we're really worried about these storms, not about the tide height.
Right.
But that's,
Yeah, I think to Sophie's point, it would be good to find out obviously what other communities are doing, so that we're not reinventing the wheel. I think we are all, correct me if I'm wrong, please, of the belief that this is an opportunity to make some changes, to propose some recommendations that do address climate change in more aggressively, whether it's that docks need to be able to be piers need to be able to be retrofitted, or that the structures need to be able to withstand storms without significant damage, you know, like
well, my
that they're
gut
removable.
feeling is that we need to embed the concern,
Right.
but we're not in a place to embed the solutions.
Right. That's a great way of saying it, actually.
Another understanding. Yes, that's good.
Yeah, I can talk to Noah, actually.
Who's Noah? What?
Yeah.
The institution, not the person.
You mean the
Yeah, the
institute?
institution, because we have a call with them soon on another project, but I can definitely, they must have recommendations. If they don't,
Yeah. Well, them and I would assume that the Army, I probably shouldn't assume anything, but the Army Corps, I think probably also, since they're the ones reviewing these projects, would have some thoughts on that.
There was
and we're
nothing
also
in
in touch
here.
with them for another project. So if you want to put those two things on my docket,
Okay?
and I'll report back, I'm happy to take them on.
I'm happy to put something on someone else's docket, so yes, thank you. But I think, to Tom's point, I think it is really important that the discussion focuses around climate change as a whole as opposed to sea level rise. Because I do think that's a really good point, that, you know, we have to talk about heights, but we also have to talk about construction techniques and durability. Maybe that's a better word, durability.
And it's not necessarily sea level rise that's the biggest threat in our harbor. It might be wave action.
Right,
Storm surge.
right, exactly, storm surge,
Because
whatever.
if you look at the models that NOAA just published, you know, sea level rise in the harbor in Camden is like, what, 5 millimeters a year or something? I mean, it's really a very slow progression.
Very slow.
But wave protection, that's a much bigger issue.
Right, exactly. And there might be solutions, to Tom's point, the solutions might be individual as dictated in the ordinance and the performance standards, but it might be also more global or whatever, i.e. a breakwater or whatever, you know what I mean? That has been proposed. And, okay,
We've also started measuring the tide heights, or continuously, in 10 places around Casco Bay. I'm not Casco Bay, Penobscot Bay.
that's right.
And one of them's right at the yacht club. So I've actually looked at that data, and you can download it.
What else? What else from the climate change standpoint do we want to consider before, because we're getting close to wrapping back up and taking votes. I don't know if I'm going to do that. We'll do that today, but is there anything else that we're not considering about climate change?
Yes, and I'm sorry if you've addressed this because I can't hear what you're talking about. But, and I don't know if it's relevant or not. But we now have algae bloom in the harbor when we didn't used to. And I don't know if that has any impact on underwater structures. I'm completely out of my depth here. I'm sorry to look like an idiot, but it might be something, you know, that we might want to understand better if there are any kind of growth that can, I mean, I'm not thinking like tentacular
Yeah.
kelp or killer kelp or things like that, but I'm just putting it out there.
Where are you, I hadn't heard that about the algae blooms. It's interesting. Where have you heard that, seen that, or whatever?
So we just talked about it last night at the Megunticook River Citizens Advisory Committee, and Seth, who's a main guide, and takes people fishing in the harbor and the river, just was mentioning that, said, we have it in the harbor now.
Huh.
Yeah.
Where is she citing this?
What's that? Elliot?
Where?
In the harbor. And they heard about it during a meeting of the Megunticook River Group. Advisory Committee. And that someone named Seth presented and talked at that and said that we are now having algae blooms in the harbor. That we
Inner
didn't.
harbor?
Did he specify inner harbor, outer harbor? He probably just said harbor.
I'll get you more information. I'll ask him more details because he noticed it. He
Huh.
takes people fishing in the river. He's a main guide.
Yeah.
And people fishing, and he noticed it, and he's very.
Interesting.
I think, it would be interesting just at least to make a note of it and say maybe that's something we need to keep tabs on.
Yeah, and I think, that's a great point because it sort of brings up this idea of what other impacts of climate change are we missing? There's, is the storm surge, is that scouring the bottom in a different way or something? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like,
Part of the permitting process, which is under the purview of the Department of Interior for these piers, does a biologic assessment, and that's via the National Environmental Policy Act. So there is regulatory oversight already that covers that subject matter.
huh, okay.
So
I guess that,
we
yeah, because
may
that
not want to reinvent.
I was going to say, that's going to get us back over into the habitat
Exactly.
category. that
So
we should be a
that's
little careful of.
Department of Interior that's,
Okay. All right. What else? I think what is, I want to ask what you guys think the next steps are for this. I don't want to, it's 20 minutes to 10 and I've got fire alarms going off in my project, so I want
Can you
to,
summarize what we've just discussed or determined?
I think my battery just went up. Sorry, Sophie. Yep, battery just went up. Yeah, should we, I mean, so we have now evaluated, well, I'm just gonna let Sophie know that we lost her on Zoom.
Going back to something that I mentioned earlier, and we've got a few minutes that we could fill here. Just the question about whether, the draft talked about the freestanding floats and floats connected directly to the land without a pier are temporary, no permit needed outside the purview of the study. But, I don't think they should be, since we're talking about what amendments might be needed, but I don't have much knowledge of what these are, how many they are, what the issues are, and if we could spin out to have some sense of, well, do we really have nothing to say on the subject, or should we spend time on it?
Yeah, I think, so I do think that we need to, when we circle back around and start to develop formal recommendations, we've spent a lot of time talking about piers. We have not spent a lot of time talking about floats and other structures in these two locations. I do think we need to look at the wording that is in the ordinance, in particular with regards to floats, because it says, I forget exactly how to phrase it, but something requiring a permit, anything requiring a permit, and that's what was
The way I understood all that is that, and maybe, Bill, you can address this, that property owners are entitled or have a right to access to the water. And that's how what's been approved, Jeremy has approved, he approves it without Harbor Committee review or Planning Board review.
They are, well, you can you can, I mean, they are afforded the right to a mooring in front of, no, they are afforded a mooring in the harbor.
Not
and it-
necessarily in front.
Not necessarily directly in front of them, but if I go and buy 27 Baby Street or whatever it may be, even though we have a wait list in the harbor for a mooring, I can have a mooring. This is my understanding of it. I can have a mooring in the harbor. And I essentially jump the line, if you will, because I'm a property owner. It doesn't necessarily, it's not right in front of 27.
Right. But
But it's not access to the water. It's not a dock. You're not afforded the right, by
and
right.
these are all regulations under the harbor ordinance, but what I'm talking about.
No, that's a state thing.
That's state?
That's state. That is a state law that you,
So the way Jeremy has interpreted it is like lakefront properties. You have a right to have a dock out there with a ramp going to your dock
on a lake or,
on lakes. So he's using that same
no, I don't think that's how,
theory in the harbor.
I don't think that's how the two floats were
No.
approved.
Where are these located? If I
They're in
wanna go
Sherman's
low-
Cove.
And
One
do they
is-
go onto the mud at low tide, or?
No, it
They're still
can't
floating.
go on the mud.
It's
That's,
shallow, but,
But it's super shallow.
so you have this
One's-
riparian right, that if you're, own that property, and you get the mooring, and, as I understand it, you can attach a float to that mooring, correct?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
But that's true of
Attach
anyone
a
with a
ramp to
mooring, or
it.
just that?
The ramp,
But then
the ramp is where we get into a,
permitting.
yeah, the ramp is where we got into a gray area. It seemed fairly unanimous that you are afforded this float and, mooring, and you can attach a float to it.
But am I allowed to attach a float to my mooring, which I just have, like everyone,
Right.
a mooring?
the harbor rules say you have to have a boat on the mooring.
Yeah, ours are
Right,
different.
but what-
Lose it
what
after a
is it
year.
that is being interpreted as the 27 Bayview Street mooring gets to put
A
a
float
float on it
on
that
it.
I don't get to put on mine.
Different regulations. See, when
But
we
am
and when you and I get our mooring from the town, there's, we get the mooring and the right to attach a boat to the mooring,
Right?
not necessarily a float.
But owning property does not make you unsubject to all of the zoning and public
Correct.
laws
Correct.
about what you can do with that property.
Yeah,
So I'm
correct.
just not quite sure
Why
why
don't
it is
we,
that people are
um,
assuming you can attach a float to a mooring. If you're getting the mooring, you jump to the lead, and you still have to have it inspected, I assume?
Right.
Yeah.
Why don't, since I think we're a little bit guessing, why don't I get that from Jeremy?
Yeah.
Because he'll have that.
So we can do
So
more
that we know
float discussion at the
So
next
I think we need
meeting.
to have more of a float discussion at the next meeting. And I think our matrix we're going to get a little complicated, but we have the outer harbor and the coastal harbor. I also think that we need to have the piers, floats, and other structures discussion as well. I don't think it's going to be nearly as in-depth as we've had on the piers, because those are the most obvious direct impacts for the harbor. Yeah, Bill?
I'll just read a couple sentences in the statute when you're asking about what happens with a shorefront owner. It says, whenever practicable, the harbor master shall assign mooring privileges in those waters where individuals own the shore rights to a parcel of land, or masters or owners of a boat or vessel, and are complainants, and shall locate suitable mooring privileges therefore, and it's subject to, not to encroach upon the natural channel or channels established by municipal officers, and not more than one mooring being assigned to any shorefront parcel of land.
Mhm.
And there's minimums in terms of frontage regarding when lot was established, but that generally doesn't apply. And then it says, the limitation of one mooring assigned under this privilege does not prevent the owner of a shorefront parcel from receiving additional mooring assignments under the allocation system. And a harbor master can always refuse if it's not going to be safe.
Right.
Or it's going to impair navigation. So That
This
went-
this is state of Maine.
This
It's
is
an
title-
actual statute.
This is Title 38, Section 3.
Yeah.
Remember, the first words were, whenever practical.
Right.
Well, also, and privileges and harbor master, to me, I interpret that as, you get to be like Bob. But you don't have to wait in line like Bob. But you get the privileges that the town's offering in terms of moorings.
As you guys have described, clearly, this statute preempts the local ordinance, and the harbor master is supposed to respond to this statute,
But when it talks about,
as far as allocation goes.
right, but in terms of what you're allowed to
Put on.
put on it,
That-
and whether you have to have it inspected and stuff like that, you're still subject to whatever the local.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would not be a problem.
What's interesting about that, too, is that it says if you are the owner or master of a vessel. So if you just want,
I'm the owner, but not the master.
well, so I don't own a boat, and I'm certainly not the master of a vessel, so, but I do have that shorefront property. I can apply for the mooring, but I may not qualify under that, because,
Yeah.
when you get a boat, come back and see me, right?
And then what qualifies as
As
a
a-
vessel?
yeah.
You know, then we're gonna get into that. Well, I got a little inflatable,
Well,
hard
but
bottom, or
also-
is it a soft
that-
bottom?
That practical means that it might be different if you've got a 15-foot motorboat or a 150-foot
Yeah.
monster.
But I think, so one of the things that we can look at, and I think we will, is the wording in our own ordinance where it refers to anything requiring a permit. And that is the ambiguity that I think we can perhaps remove when we make recommendations. Because that's what introduced this sort of
Well,
situation in.
Reading that, that's actually still requires a permit.
Just
Maybe
by,
not under our ordinance, but it is saying you have to go to the harbor master.
right,
Permission,
You need to be told where you're gonna be and what you can do with it.
right.
No, but it's a construction permit.
Well, there's the problem.
A permit to construct something, and that's why the floats with the dock on it are considered temporary.
There's the problem is
With a
that it
ramp.
says anything requiring a permit. It doesn't say anything requiring a construction permit or a
okay.
federal permit or a state permit. It just says anything requiring a permit,
Mooring permit.
which is a mooring permit, and it is actually called a mooring permit.
Statement from the harbor master.
So that is a place where we can clean things up and hopefully.
You can put your float out there and have a ramp, but you can't put any anchors down to the bottom, because that's a mooring.
See, I mean, what we really need here is Jeremy to explain to us how he approved the two
right.
in Sherman's Code, because he did
Well,
it
and-
without any, he was able to do it himself.
Well, the select board got involved. The select board approved them.
They did?
They did. Yep,
But it wasn't the planning board, it wasn't the harbor committee.
I know.
But Joss, would you agree that in terms of us coming to some sort of structure so that we can
Yeah.
present something, that we need to create additional understandings, not any, on all of these matters related to floats?
Yep.
As we did with piers.
Yep.
So we don't have any conclusions yet, but we do have an understanding.
But now we're getting
If
closer
we
to
can, if we can at
understanding.
least have that structure for floats, then we can go back and look more comprehensively at inner harbor, outer harbor, and begin to vote on
Brass tacks.
Specific proposed
Specifics.
changes.
Yeah.
changes, right?
Yep. 'Cause I-
So our next logical step would be come to some understandings about these things, these categories, as they relate to floats.
Yep.
Once we complete that, we can go to the final step of coming up with some
Actual recommendations.
recommendations.
Yep.
Right, and I think that when you do the recommendations, looking at the ordinance, then we circle back to the draft, sort of articulation of the whys, that will integrate any proposed changes, or explaining why we don't feel it's necessary.
Why we don't even have to go there.
So I do think, so I think sort of next time, at our next meeting, We'll do exactly that. We'll generate, I have a few notes of things that I want to get from Jeremy, and we will sort of go through the floats side of it now. But then I'm hoping at the next meeting, we can start to go through the ordinance, in particular, our Harbor and Waterways ordinance. So please, everybody, just read through it again. And we'll start to look at that and say, what in particular do we think we can accomplish, or recommend, rather?
If
as
anything.
relates- If anything, yeah, if we're doing any.
Well, I think we may want to remember when we're reading it, to also look for the blank stuff. In other words, I
Are we
doubt
missing?
that this really addresses that thing we were just talking about how to get the concern about global warming in there, because
Doesn't exist.
I don't think it existed.
Yeah.
They had a few hard, fast things, but not because they were thinking about sea level rise particularly.
Okay, so that will be the next, so this is September, so that'll be October. I think my goal, just so everybody knows, is we will begin voting and having action items at the next meeting. We'll do the floats.
Now or the next after October?
No, I think October. I think we can probably get there. We can do the floats and it will be floats and other structures is what we'll tackle. I think we can tackle them all together at the next meeting, and hopefully begin coming up with some recommendations in the October meeting, and then finalize them in the November meeting. November is when I'm hoping we can actually have a final, this is it, this is what I should say, we'll finish it in November, and then we'll decide if we want to involve other entities at that stage.
Do you have a date for October?
Nope, but that's,
What was the second action item for Sophie? She's doing, she's going to look into the other towns' climate change mitigation.
other challenge,
He's looking at the
Yeah.
let's look at October, excuse me. Yeah, October's rough. Boy, oh boy, oh boy.
5, 12,
I don't think I'm going to be here on the 19th. I'm thinking the 12th. And is the 12th tentative?
Wednesday.
12th is a Wednesday. Is that tentatively okay for everybody? I'm told, we're supposed to be checking with Janice on whether this room is available on those dates. But let's tentatively set 10, 12, 8 o'clock for next meeting. I've got a lot going on in October, so I will tell you that we might need to change that one, but we'll see. And then into November,
I'm out in November,
are you out the whole month, Mark?
yeah. Taking my boat to Florida.
Lucky you.
But you can
But
easily
you
Zoom
could,
it.
right,
I could Zoom
You can Zoom it from the dismal swamp.
it. Yeah, right.
I'm tentatively thinking it'll be like the 16th of November, just to, you guys can sort of
That's the only
just,
part of that trip I've done.
Dismal Swamp.
The Dismal Swamp Canal and into what's the name of the town where Joe Namath's wife came from?
Oh, good.
Josh, I have a question. With regard to the town of Camden, what is the status of the Sherman and Rixon pier applications?
my understanding is the Rixon Pier application, which is in the outer harbor, has been approved prior to the deadline, so that one is just pending construction. That one is permitted, done, ready to go. I don't know where they are.
Prior to what?
That was prior to the ordinance, the moratorium, the moratorium.
Town of Camden approved it prior to March 15th.
My understanding that the Rixon Pier in the outer harbor, that is the case. The Sherman Pier in the coastal harbor is on hold, is pending, because the town has not approved that one. We have, but the select board has not.
And In the Sherman documents, I noticed that George Sherman is deceased. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
I think he died in the process.
Oh, heavens.
And how does that affect the process and the permitting when the applicant dies?
Well, one of the applicants. There was-
One.
there was
I was
two
gonna say, I think there's
two
other applicants, and
Kelly.
I think it,
Like, I can't cite specifically,
Yeah,
but I noticed where it was just his name, and there were no other applicants.
I don't know for sure, but my understanding is that application is still, that application is still pending, hasn't been withdrawn and/or voided, so I think it's still active. Maybe his family is proceeding with it, I'm not really sure, Elliot, on that one. Future, before we break up, just future meetings, and this is one of the reasons why we have to stay a little bit focused for next couple of times. We do have other things to do. So my understanding is that the harbor master will have his end of season reviews in the next few weeks with the day sailors.
Yep.
So then we have to review, they're actually up apparently. So we'll have to review all their licenses. So I want to put that on everybody's radar, that the day sailor permit, day sailor license reviews will be coming, and I think that will probably be in November. Possibly another one.
Day Sailor and Windjammers, same time.
I'd have to check.
I think that's-
Did we get them on the same year?
We tried to do that, yes.
Okay.
So that everybody gets reviewed at the same time.
Okay, so then, yeah, so then all those are coming.
That's
We
it.
also have a proposal that will be coming regarding dinghies at the dinghy dock. So a new proposal for that. So that's going to be another sort of lively discussion, I suspect. And then lastly, harbor fees. So we have to set the harbor fees again, and that one needs to be done by December. So that will be on our December agenda, is the harbor fee schedule.
Okay, and I had asked for kind of like the finances, the revenues and the expenses, so that we could look at that when we're setting fees, as opposed to just, just guessing.
Yeah. And that we should be able to get as a public document. We won't get anything special, if you will, but we should be able to get, the budget is a public document.
Okay.
So it'll be last year's, because
Yeah,
they
that's-
haven't
yeah.
finalized this year.
Right.
But we should be able to get that, certainly, as a public document. Anything else?
Steve will be here at some point, right, so we can ask him how this year has been going.
Yeah, from what I
Yeah.
understand, this year's revenue exceeded the previous year's revenue.
Really?
Where is this dinghy proposal coming from?
Steve and the harbor master and Liz. There have been a number of, as we all know, a number of complaints about the overcrowding at the dinghy dock. And so this year there was even more. So they're like, okay, we need to come up with, I got an email that said they're coming up with a proposal for how to handle it. They'd like to present it to
Is
us.
that going to include the steamboat landing?
I think it has to. I think it has to be everything.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
I
it's-
have to say, I've completely changed my opinion. It's an impossible mess of rubber dinghies over there, so that when you come in,
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to get to the dock to tie your boat in an awkward position now.
It's all getting used, which is great, but it is showing the need for greater management. Yes.
So, maybe this is for you, Josh. Can you talk to Lyman Morris about maybe trying to incorporate launch service with the town and, because what I found, I leave my dinghy out on the boat, because I don't mind at the dock. And I've been taking the launch service back and forth. So the number of times I go back and forth, it's worth it. And,
So should that be part of maybe that's part of the proposal? We'll see. Who knows? We'll see. I don't know. I have no knowledge of this.
They're supposedly coordinating with the yacht club this year to get extended hours.
Yeah, Lyman Morrison, the yacht club last year started collaborating, so in the shoulder seasons,
Yeah.
they sort of shift off so that one does one day, one does the other.
collaborate with the yacht club, maybe you can.
Collaborate with the town, yeah. Here you go, Mark. We'll see.
Just see there.
Yes, I like it. Anything else before we adjourn? Awesome. Thank you, guys. Another spirited discussion.
It wasn't spirited.
That was spirited. Good. I think these brainstorming sessions are awesome. Some of them actually.
Spirit is when you
Spirited,
dirty rat.
Yeah.
That's when that comes forward.
Yeah, I think like raised voices.
I never consider spirited.
Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin.
Yeah, right.
Showing my age.
I'm right there with you. You conehead.
Thanks for your time.
See you.
Thanks, Tom. See ya.